Okay, if scientists are after truth, what is this great method you're talking about, Professor? Well, the method is called the scientific method. It can also be called the empirical method. And it works in this circle, as you see on this slide. This slide is from an Intro to Psychology textbook. Nothing fancy here. This is the most basic concept in all of the sciences, whether it's biology or psychology or sociology, okay? Science works in this fashion. And please understand that first quiz or exam, you'll have to know these little boxes in the particular order in which they go. So let's talk about this for a second. So, where do you start? Well, that's kind of a crazy question sometimes. If you're not a scientist, you don't start. But let's say you take research methods class, which is next semester for some of you, or it's this semester for some of you. If you take a research methods class, well, your instructor is going to have you do some science. Where are you going to start? Well, you might want to start with an idea, a topic. What do you want to study? There might be a disease in your family's history that you'd like to look into, or maybe you just want to do a cute study on personal relationships or Facebook or something like that. Okay, but you have to have a topic. Okay, if you are a graduate student working in a lab, you probably have picked a topic, and you're actually focused on getting into your laboratory because of the work that particular lab does. So, in that case, you might just have to refine the focus of your research. But the research will start with a review of the literature. You have to find out what's out there. And you can't just look at the last 5 years. You got to go back 30 years, especially on some of these topics. I mean, if it's social media, you don't have to go back that far because there was no social media 30 years ago, okay? But, if you're doing, perhaps a research project on e-cigarettes, again, you don't have to go back that far because there isn't that much data to go back. But if you're measuring self-esteem in relationships, you're going to have to go back to the 60s to see the research that was done then. Okay, so you have to do a thorough review of the literature. And what you'll probably find is there's pros and cons in the literature. Once you get a good idea of what the existing body of knowledge is within the scientific community in your particular field in question, that's when then you have to move to the second step right here, which is to formulate a testable hypothesis. And this is what we train you in research methods class. This is kind of what we train you when you take statistics class. The hypothesis has to be testable. Honestly, you have to be able to prove it false, because that's actually easier to do than proving something true. That's this whole bit about the null hypothesis, why that's a very confusing topic for most, but it's the essence of science. The null hypothesis is there's no difference between groups. If we can prove that false with our statistical analysis, then that means there is a difference between the groups. You have a relationship between your variables, between your independent variable and your dependent variable, something we'll get into in the next slide. You might have been taught in the 3rd or 4th grade that the hypothesis is an educated guess, and that's not a bad generalization. But in science, it's a direct, bold statement. Cigarettes cause cancer. Okay, it's not like, do cigarettes cause cancer? No, it's cigarettes cause cancer. And we set out to prove that false to see if we can. Okay, and if we can't prove it false, then the end result is true. After you design a testable hypothesis, you move to the design of the study. Again, this is what a research method class will teach you. You got to do the proper study. You have to collect the data properly. There are a lot of rules. Then you do the statistics. You analyze the data. You come up with your numbers. You see if you have a significant relationship or not. And you decide whether to accept or reject your hypothesis. Let's say you accept your hypothesis. You got a good working hypothesis. You found some really neat stuff. Now you want to go and you publish your paper in a journal, which is not an easy thing to do. And then over time, your concept, your theory might be built over dozens or hundreds of hypotheses that have been supported to build a theory, a scientific theory. Now let's talk about that word scientific theory for a second, okay? Because theory is a funny word. It actually has two worlds, two perspectives in the general sense. You can say you have a theory about your roommate, that they're a particular slob or something like that. And it's based on very little evidence. Maybe they left the dishes in the sink overnight 2 times. Okay? They left their clothes in the living room. That's not a scientific theory. That's the way we use that theory which is the opposite of how scientists use that theory. So theory in that casual sense is based on very little data. But a scientific theory, you only get to a scientific theory after dozens or hundreds of hypotheses keep pointing in the same directions. Yes, cigarettes do cause cancer. Okay, so a theory can build over time. Now, honestly, this circle, if you don't get acceptable data, maybe you tweak your study, you go back and do it again. Maybe you get some evidence and that leads to more questions and you do another study and another study. This is what goes on in scientific labs across the nation. They have setbacks, they alter their theories, redo the study. Over time, they find the proper avenue, the proper bit of research to get to a solid theory. So that is the scientific method, my friends. Please know that I will ask you questions on the quiz or exam about what comes before or after one of these so-called building blocks of scientific method.